One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and is the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. This is probably going to be the last episode in 2023 as we head into the new year. And we're going to be using this episode to close out our mini-series on longevity and health span. This is part 9 if you've been tracking. And today we're going to be talking about how to actually do zone 2 as well as some type of interval training. And in our last episode, we went over the pros and cons of zone 2 cardio, which is that low intensity, steady state or continuous work type of activity. And we compared that to the pros and cons of high intensity interval training or HIIT. And the bottom line is this, that while there are some adaptations that are common to both, like improvements in your VO2 max, increased vascularization and blood flow, increases in the number as well as the function of things like mitochondria, there are metabolic adaptations and advantages to each training type, such that you need to do a combination of both in your weekly exercise routine. And you are exercising several days per week, right? At least you will be in 2024. So today we're going to put some practical legs on all of this theory and science that we've been talking about. And, after all, if you can't do something with new information you've learned, what's the point of learning it? Like, information for the sake of information is impractical at best. So let's talk about how to do zone 2 cardio first, and then we'll talk about interval training and how to put that together. If you Google this, meaning if you Google zone 2 training, you're going to see a lot of people talking about heart rate training zones, and this can be very helpful as a starting point. But if I told you that zone 2 was a given percentage of your theoretical maximum heart rate, I'm assuming that this mathematical calculation actually fits you as an individual. Remember that many of the things that you hear about different exercises or even different diets or nutritional supplements, these are averages across large groups of people. And the average reflects the entire group, but any individual within that group might be lower or higher than the average for the group itself. And this is true with things like heart rate intensities and training zones. So, and I'll just give you an example. If I said that the average middle-aged North American female weighs 150 pounds, that doesn't mean that every middle-aged female in North America actually weighs 150 pounds. Some are going to weigh 101 pounds, and some might weigh 300 pounds. And so the average is for the group, and it is a generalization. So if you hear or read that zone 2 training is at, say, 75% of your theoretical maximum heart rate, or 60%, that's an average. It's a guideline. As an individual, you might be working in zone 2 at heart rates higher or lower than what some of these published guidelines would suggest. And this is how it works. The more inflamed or deconditioned and metabolically compromised you are, or the lower your VO2 max is, the lower your heart rate will be in any given zone. And we're talking about zone 2 in particular. Plus, the easier it will be for a slightly higher heart rate to kick you out of zone 2 into zone 3, which means your fat oxidation or your fat utilization goes down and you start relying more on glucose as an energy source. And if that's your goal, that's fine. But if your goal is zone 2 and optimizing fat metabolism and all the things that go along with that, then you need to stick into zone 2. And again, all of this is just based on what your goals are, what you're trying to accomplish. On the other hand, if your VO2 max is higher, if you're less inflamed and you have better physical conditioning, if you have more metabolic control and have some degree of metabolic flexibility, this means that you can stay in zone 2 fat burning mode at higher exercise intensities and even higher heart rates than the published guidelines might suggest for you. And this is why I say that all of these heart rate-based training zones are starting points and guidelines, but you have to optimize that, individualize that for yourself. We have studies, for example, some that use elite competitive cyclists that show that they stay in zone 2 fat burning mode at exercise intensities that would put you and me squarely in zone 5, as if we were doing high intensity interval training. But that's because their VO2 max is usually, somewhere in the vicinity of maybe 90 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute, whereas the average VO2 max of the average North American sedentary person is typically less than 30. And that's a threefold difference. So you can see part of the advantage of having really good VO2 max is that you can exercise at higher intensities and stay in this mitochondrial efficiency fat burning zone, again, if that's the goal that you're looking for. So the idea that we can set heart rate training zones that apply to each person specifically is naive. So I suggest, again, use these heart rate numbers and percentages as a guideline, as a simple starting point. So according to experts in VO2 max training, there are two ways that you can know if you're truly in zone 2, and they involve your breathing pattern. You may have heard of this before, but regardless of what your heart rate is at the moment, if you pay attention to your breath and your breathing pattern, it will tell you if you're in zone 2 or below that or above that. So the first of these two ways is whether or not you can exercise breathing strictly through your nose. We call it nasal only breathing. And, truth be told, if you can breathe only through your nose and you keep exercising 30, 40, 45 minutes or so, you're probably at the bottom of zone 2, perhaps even in zone 1. And this is why I like starting with the heart rate estimate to get me close to the right intensity level, and use some kind of a breathing test to make sure that I dial myself in, right, to personalize it for myself. And what happens over time is that you can start correlating the workload that gets you in the right breathing pattern with your heart rate, so you can, again, begin to personalize it so you can actually use heart rate more efficiently and more effectively. And here's why this works. Like, remember that as you increase your work output, you need to make more ATP or more energy to fuel that increased workload. And even if you're still using oxygen and fat in your mitochondria, this means that you're creating more carbon dioxide as a metabolic byproduct. It's essentially a waste product that has to be cleared and handled. And there's several different ways the body does that, including respiration. And so as your work output and intensity increases, so does your CO2 level. Again, this is metabolic waste. It needs to be controlled. And so at some point, the carbon dioxide levels rise faster than you can handle them metabolically. And so your body has to increase your respiratory rate to bring in more oxygen, to blow off more carbon dioxide with your breathing pattern. And so deep, rhythmic, but comfortable breathing through your nose during exercise means you're in zone 2. And I mean deep, rhythmic, comfortable exercise that is deeper and more rhythmic than if you were just sitting on the couch. So if you're doing exercise and you have an increased respiratory rate, but you still can do it only through your nose, in through your nose, out through your nose, you're in zone 2. But it doesn't mean that you've hit that sweet spot that I've been talking about, which is the upper limit of zone 2, right where you start. You're right on the cusp of going into zone 3, which is now you start tapping into more glucose and less fat, even though you're still burning both. So the best place to build your VO2 max and your mitochondrial efficiency in terms of using fat as fuel is right at that point where if you just went a little bit harder, a little bit faster, you'd slip into zone 3. And you can't do that if it's easy to breathe through your nose, right? If you're breathing through your nose and it's easy to sustain, you're not on the cusp, you're not in the sweet spot. And you know that you've hit the sweet spot of that upper part of zone 2 right before zone 3 when you have to start breathing through your mouth. But you can still talk in short sentences. And this is called the talk test. So we have a nasal only test and we have just the general talk test. And the talk test is the best way to know if you are on the cusp, or you're right at the top of zone 2, you're right in that sweet spot. It means that you're breathing through your mouth, but you're not breathing so heavily that you couldn't carry on a conversation. But you should be out of breath enough that carrying on a continuous conversation is possible, but you have to take maybe a break every few words. And in other words, the talk test means that you're able to speak in these shorter sentences with pauses every so often to catch your breath. And it also means that if you're talking, for example, on the phone with someone or someone next to you, they should be able to tell that you're exercising because they can hear it in your breathing pattern. And this takes some practice to get right. So when you start doing this, give yourself a few sessions to really dial it in. Like, don't expect you to hit this perfectly right out of the gate. Start with your estimated heart rate, but confirm that you're in the sweet spot of zone 2 by using the breath test. And of course, if you don't have a way to check your heart rate while you're exercising, you just simply use the talk test by itself. So here are my simple steps to find your zone 2 sweet spot. And the goal, again, is to be right at the upper end of your personalized zone 2 heart rate range, right at the cusp of entering zone 3. So step number 1, you're going to calculate your theoretical maximum heart rate. And if you Google this, there are several published equations on how to do this. But the most common one, and perhaps the easiest, is just simply to subtract your age from 220. So your theoretical maximum heart rate is 220 minus your age. Then you multiply your theoretical maximum heart rate by, in our example, remember, we're kind of splitting the difference between what people say is zone 2. We're going to go right at 70%. So you're going to multiply this theoretical maximum heart rate by 70% or 0.7. And you're going to set that as your initial target for zone 2 training. Remember that opinions about where zone 2 begins and ends is going to vary from organization to organization or person to person. Some people say it's 60 to 70%, others 70, 80. Again, we're going to split the middle. We're going to use 70%. And it's a starting point, but we still need to check the talk test and then modify our exercise output or intensity based on the talk test. So you choose some exercise modality, whether that's a treadmill, an elliptical, walking, a rowing machine, whatever your preference is. You do a warm-up. Again, make sure you're warmed up and doing this safely. You start your exercise. You increase your intensity until your heart rate reaches this 70% of your maximum heart rate. And then you check to see if you can nasal breathe. If you can carry on nasal breathing only, then you need to increase your speed or intensity such that you have to start breathing through your mouth. And then you use the talk test again to see if you're in the sweet spot. And as it relates to the talk test, regardless of what your heart rate is, and regardless of what the recommended zones are and percentages, if you fail the talk test, meaning that you can't really talk at all, or you're so out of breath that you can't have a conversation, then you need to dial it back a bit. So you reduce your speed or your intensity to a heart rate that allows you to pass the talk test. On the other hand, if you can talk without any struggle at all, like I'm talking right now, then you have to pick up the pace until you do struggle, but just a little bit. They call it a conversational pace, but the person you're talking to should know that you're exercising. So no matter what your heart rate is, no matter what percentage of your max heart rate that number turns out to be, the talk test will tell you when you're in the zone 2 sweet spot. So let me walk you through an example using some numbers. Let's say that you're 55 years old, and I'm just picking numbers. Your theoretical maximum heart rate then is 220 minus 55, which is 165 beats per minute. Again, that's simply calculated, 220 minus your age. And I say theoretical maximum heart rate because not only are there different equations to estimate that, so it's all theoretical, these are all just estimates. There can actually be a difference between your calculated theoretical maximum heart rate and your actual or realized maximum heart rate. So regardless of your age and what the 220 minus your age number gives you, you might be limited to less than that. You might be fortunate and be able to accomplish a heart rate above whatever this calculation is, but it's all an estimate and it's all a starting point. So in our example, we have a 55-year-old with a maximum heart rate of, say, 165, theoretical. Next, we multiply that 165 by 0.7 or 70% to set our target heart rate at 70% of the max heart rate. And that turns out to be 115 and a half, let's call it 116 if we round up. So 165 times 0.7. Now let's say that this 55-year-old likes the treadmill. So they hop on, they do a warm-up, they start to increase their speed, perhaps the incline to increase their workload. And just a comment here, and I think I've said this before in prior episodes, but if you prefer treadmill indoors, you really want to have at least a 1% or degree incline on the treadmill belt, because that will mimic the force production that you have to use when you're outside propelling yourself. Remember, when you're on a treadmill, there's a motor turning the belt. You're just trying to keep up with it. When you're walking outside, the ground's not moving. You have to push a little harder to work outside. And so we compensate for that indoors on a treadmill by raising the treadmill, just elevating it very slightly, just 1 degree or one percentage. So they hop on the treadmill, they do their warm up, they increase their workload. And when their heart rate hits, in this example, 115, 116, which is that 70% calculation we did, they check to see if they can just breathe through their nose, in and out through their nose. And if they can, they need to increase their speed or their incline until they start to breathe through their mouth. And once they do, then they use the talk test to see if they're in the sweet spot. It's really that simple. So you calculate your estimated zone 2 target heart rate. Then you use the breathing tests, the nasal only and the talk test, to determine if that calculated number suits you. And if you end up confirming that your actual zone 2 sweet spot heart rate is either higher and lower than what you calculated, remember to note that the next time for your next session, so that you use your real numbers as your target heart rate and not the calculation. Sometimes the calculation's off, right? These are averages, and we're looking for individualization, right? The calculation, again, is just a starting point. So the first few sessions that you do in zone 2 training are really supposed to be helping you to find your rhythm, to figure out how to hit that sweet spot, what heart rate is appropriate, what breathing pattern, what work rate and intensity. If we're using treadmill as an example, how fast is the belt moving? What is my elevation in terms of degrees? And it should be at least 1 degree, 1%. So how do I put all these variables together to get my heart rate up and my breathing pattern dialed in so that I know I'm in the sweet spot? So again, let me say it this way, what you'll find over time is that as your VO2 max and your zone 2 capacity grows, you'll find that it takes a higher heart rate to hit the sweet spot. And that's good, right? In other words, the heart rate where you failed the talk test in the beginning is now not intense enough because you have more capacity and you have to up your game to hit the sweet spot again. And that's progress. That is adaptation. That is exactly what you're looking for. When you get to the point where you say to yourself, hey, what used to be my warm-up, what used to be my workout is now my warm-up, right? You're on the right track if that's what you're starting to think. And what you can feel good about is that you've increased your VO2 max. You've improved your mitochondria. You've enhanced your fat burning efficiency. You've improved your metabolic control and flexibility. And you've probably even reduced your risk for all-cause mortality. Who doesn't want that? So what about the minimum effective dose? Like if you remember from previous episodes, I said that the national guidelines for exercise are 150 minutes per week of low to moderate intensity. Let's call it zone 2 cardio. And many experts say that the best approach is to do zone 2 work in 40 to 45 minute sessions. And so this translates, if we go by the national guidelines, that translates to 3 or 4 sessions per week of about 45 minutes each of low intensity steady state cardio where your heart rate is in the sweet spot of zone 2. But what if that is more than your system can handle right now? Right? I work with a lot of clients all the time who either have severely limited what they can do in terms of exercise because they crash very easily, or they've had to stop altogether because they're so metabolically challenged. So if you can't handle a full 3 to 4 sessions per week doing 40 to 45 minutes of zone 2 cardio, that's a goal to work towards. But the right question to ask is, the phrase that I used just a moment ago is, what is the minimum effective dose? Like, what's the least amount of time of zone 2 work that I can do each week and still get something good for myself and not waste my time? And the answer to that is probably 2 20-minute sessions. Now, understand that that's the minimum. It won't maximize or optimize your results and your adaptations, but it will get you moving in the right direction. It's probably a good place to start if you have concerns about your metabolic state and your capacity. And the good thing is that once you adapt to 2 20-minute sessions, and that becomes relatively easy for you, or easier than it used to be, then you can either stay at twice a week and add time. So you go, instead of twice a week for 20 minutes each, you go from 20-minute sessions to 30-minute sessions, and you continue to build your capacity up to maybe 2 45-minute sessions per week. And after you're doing that, you can add a third session with the goal of doing 3 45-minute sessions per week. And then you're going to be right in and around the national guidelines. But I want you to remember that zone 2 training won't give you everything that you need. Like zone 5 or interval type training confers benefits that zone 2 does not, because it uses different muscle fibers and different energy systems. Therefore, the demand and the adaptations can be different as well. So, but again, I'll remind you, these systems are interlinked, right? One affects the other, and we need and want to develop capacity in both if we are expecting to be healthy. So let's switch over to zone 5 or high intensity interval training. I think some experts are getting away from the high adjective, like high intensity interval training, and they're just simply talking about interval training. Because when you say high intensity interval training, it has certain connotations. It might be a little bit scary. So let me help you calm down about that if it's concerning you, if I'm saying, hey, you need to do high intensity interval training. While there's really only one way to do zone 2 training, there's an infinite number of ways to do interval training. So, let me clarify that statement. Like you can do zone 2 training with any exercise modality. So your options there are somewhat limitless. But it all uses the same exercise intensity level that you can sustain for 20 to 45 minutes. With zone 2, you can still choose any modality you want, whether that's walking or jogging or running, sprinting, elliptical machine, bicycle ergometer, rowing machine, swimming, concept 2, ski erg, kettlebells, all of these things. You can use any modality. The nature of interval type training introduces a new concept into our mental framework, and that is the concept of work intervals followed by rest intervals, and therein there are endless combinations. For example, perhaps the most well-known and now classic Tabata protocol, Tabata, uses 20 seconds of very high-intensity work, say all-out sprinting, followed by 10 seconds of active rest, like walking or jogging. And this cycle of 20 seconds really hard, 10 seconds active rest is repeated 8 times for a total of 40 minutes. I'm sorry, 4 minutes, not 40 minutes. And while the Tabata protocol, again, is perhaps the best known version of interval training, I'm sure many of you have heard of this. And Tabata is really the guy who introduced the concept of interval training into our generation. That 20 seconds of full out exercise with only 10 seconds of rest is not the only way to do interval training. And for some of you, it's certainly not the best place to start, and I would advise against it. But here's the thing to remember about zone 5 or some version of interval training. It uses and optimizes a different energy system than zone 2. So again, it's not about doing zone 2 versus zone 5 or intervals as if they're mutually exclusive. And again, you're going to get sick of me saying it, but there are several adaptations that are common to both training modes, but zone 5 gives you things that zone 2 doesn't. Zone 2 gives you things that interval training doesn't. And that is, with the interval training, you get excellent control and utilization of blood sugar as opposed to fats, and the ability to produce and tolerate higher demand activities. And that mostly comes in fatigue management, because you teach your body to handle metabolic waste products more efficiently and more effectively. Now, maybe you're saying, I don't need to do high demand stuff. Like all I do is sit at a desk and the heaviest thing I lift is a stapler. And that's fine. I get it. But the point of doing hard things is not just to do the hard things, but to do the things that being able to do hard things allows you to do. Meaning that interval training and higher intensity work is a means to an end. So how do you design and implement a HIIT session or an interval training session? How many sessions should you do each week? How long should your work and your rest intervals be? Well, it's a tough call because there's so many different ways to do it. So let's try to narrow it down and give you some guidelines. I think the only thing that most people in this space would agree on is the average person like you and me should do no more than 2 interval training sessions per week. And the good news is that since they're higher output activities, it takes the time to complete it takes far less than zone 2 training. By definition, you cannot sustain zone 5 output for 45 minutes because that would be zone 2. It's a different system, remember. There is an inverse relationship between intensity and duration. The lower the intensity, the longer duration and more frequently you can do it because the demand is less and the recovery is easier. Conversely, the higher your intensity and work output is, the less frequently you can do it and also recover. And therefore, the shorter your sessions need to be. I just mentioned the Tabata protocol, which is a 4-minute workout consisting of 8 rounds of some activity using 20-second really hard work intervals followed by 10 seconds of active rest. Again, that doesn't mean you can or even should start there. Believe me that if you are sedentary and relatively deconditioned, you might get through the first couple of your intervals, and then you're going to have to stop because it's more than your body can handle. And it's not really, and this is a whole different discussion, but it's not really an energy supply problem. It's usually the fatigue and waste management side that limits your output and your capacity. And to be honest, much of the research using Tabata-style workout sessions are done on college students. And many times they use college athletes who have some level of training and conditioning already. And so, again, Tabata is very well known. And if you Google interval training or high-intensity interval training, you're probably going to come up with many hits that talk about Tabata. It's probably not the best place for you to start if you're going to implement intervals. Enter the idea of moderate intensity interval training. So now we have zone 2, which is your low intensity, steady state continuous work. And we have at the other end, very high intensity interval training, what I've been calling zone 5. And that's your classic Tabata. But what about in between? What about moderate intensity? Is there any benefit to doing that? Moderate intensity interval training is where you still do intervals of work and rest, but the work intervals are less intense and last longer than, say, a classic Tabata approach, which is very high intensity work. And additionally, since this is an interval mode of training, the work output for moderate intensity intervals is higher than zone 2 work, and as a result requires less time. And furthermore, moderate intensity interval training is a great way to introduce intervals in such a way that you can pick a starting point and then work yourself into more intense and more demanding intervals over time. Because remember, there is value to all of it. Think of moderate intensity interval training as the love child of zone 2 and zone 5. It blends aspects of both approaches. And again, there are many ways to put this together, but let's start with what PhD researcher Dr. Marty Gabala shared with me during an interview that I did earlier this year on my podcast for doctors called the Funk Med Nation. And by the way, I'm going to share my interview with Dr. Gabala here on the Inflammation Nation podcast, even though I did it from the context of, hey, let's talk to doctors and clinicians. He shared so much wonderful information. I want to share that with you as well. And I'll be posting that here in a couple of weeks, so make sure you listen to that. If your goal is to harness the power of interval training and minimize the time required, as well as the chance that that type of work is going to crash your system, then moderate intensity intervals designed properly could be your sweet spot. And since intervals of work and rest are infinitely variable, and because you can choose any modality of exercise that you like, you can pretty much set things up in any number of different ways. So, twice a week, you could do 3 to 5 intervals of moderate intensity, lasting 3 to 5 minutes long. And the more deconditioned, inflamed, or metabolically deranged you are, the longer your work intervals should be, since they are less intense and less demanding. Even though they're still demanding, they're just less demanding than shorter, harder, faster ones. So, for example, you could start with 3 rounds of 5 minutes of work intervals. The less inflamed and metabolically deranged you are, the shorter and harder your work intervals should be. And so maybe if you have some conditioning capacity, maybe you start, instead of 3 rounds of 5 minutes, you start with 5 rounds of 3 minutes, which is harder and more demanding. And depending on how you set up and how many rounds you do and what your work rest intervals are, these sessions, these moderate intensity interval training sessions, shouldn't take more than 25 to 30 minutes to complete. Now, that's not including necessarily an appropriate 3 to 5 minute warm up and 3 to 5 minute cool down. So we're somewhere around 30 minutes regardless. So for a beginner, I would suggest the following. Start with 3 rounds of 5 minute work intervals, followed by at least 3 and up to 5 minutes of active rest. So you could be doing 5 minutes and 3 minutes or 5 minutes and 5 minutes. That's your work rest ratio. And again, active rest means that you keep doing the thing that you're doing, just at a very slow pace to let your breathing and your heart rate recover. Like don't go out hard for 3 minutes or 4 minutes or 5 minutes and then completely stop and just stand there. That's going to be not good for some people, because you get pooling of blood and people can pass out and faint. So you keep doing the work that you're doing to keep your blood flowing and let your heart rate and your breathing settle down. And for each work interval, for a beginner, let's say starting with 5 minute work intervals, you need to use a pace or intensity that you can sustain for the full 5 minutes. But, and here's the trick, the last minute, specifically the last 30 seconds of that 5 minute interval, should be the hardest. And you literally should be looking at your watch or looking at the timer, counting down the seconds to when you can slow down and go into your active rest interval. If you finish the last minute of a moderate intense interval training, if you finish that last minute and you could easily keep going at the same pace, then you're not pushing hard enough. You're not getting what you need to out of that session. Usually, and again, for this example, we're seeing start with a 5 minute work interval. Usually the first 2 minutes of that 5 minute interval is used to get your heart rate up to your working level. The next 2 minutes of the 5 minutes, so minutes 3 and 4, are harder than the first. But that final minute, the 5th minute, that's when you really work for it, particularly the last 30 seconds. And remember, this is moderate intensity, not high intensity. You're not going as hard as you can, although in the moment it's going to feel like this is as hard as I can go, because you've already been working for 4 minutes up until your 5th. And that's different than going all out from go for 20 seconds and then going into active rest. It's different. Moderate intensity, not high, even though your perceived effort in that 5th minute is like, this is intense. The challenge in that last minute comes not from using a higher intensity in an absolute sense, but from the accumulation of the moderate intensity work that you've been doing in minutes 1, 2, 3, and 4. That makes that fifth minute feel very hard, even though if we let you rest for 10 minutes and said go hard and fast for 20 minutes or 20 seconds, you'd be pushing much harder for that 20 seconds than you are in the last 30 seconds of your 5 minute interval. Now for me, I try to train using different modalities. So I I mix and match between treadmill, a rowing machine, an elliptical machine, and something called an echo bike, which is, you might remember the old Schwinn Airdynes where you're on a bike, but it also has handles that you move back and forth. And I just happen to like the brand Rogue, and they make something called an echo bike, but there's several other companies that make these things. But I like to use the elliptical for this kind of training. Number one, because it mimics running. Running pounds my joints, but the elliptical doesn't, but I can mimic the movement. And also, using an elliptical machine is not technically challenging. I'm not a great runner in terms of distance, for sure. And so running is challenging for me. And what I would suggest to you is that you pick an exercise modality that is not technically challenging for you so that you can do it safely, something that's easy to learn if you're not familiar with it, and presents less risk for potential injury. Make sure that whatever modality you choose, make sure you're safe and don't run the risk of injury from poor technique. You can imagine if you're running as hard as you can in your fifth minute, the last 30 seconds of one of these intervals, but you're not a good runner and you turn an ankle on a treadmill. That's not good. You don't want to do that. So pick something that is not technically challenging for you for where you are. The other thing I like about the elliptical is because when I hit that final minute, say in this example, the fifth minute of a 5-minute interval, I can do a quick check of my status and I can gauge if my intensity level is right for the coming final minute. And if I feel like, no, I can push harder, I can very easily increase my work level without having to stop the exercise and reset the equipment. I just press a button once or twice, and all of a sudden my workload for that last minute goes up. Because remember, that last minute is where all the money and the gold comes from. That's where you want to be really challenged. And likewise, if I hit that fifth minute, the start of the fifth minute, and I'm like, oh, I came out too hard, I don't think I can finish the fifth minute at this pace, then I can back it off a little bit so that those last 30 seconds, I can still complete them. And it only takes a couple of sessions of practice to get this right. So give yourself some grace, give yourself some leeway as you start to do this to kind of figure out all the mechanics of how this works. But after the second, maybe third week, you should be dialed into a routine where you know exactly what your work intensities are, you know your breathing patterns, you know your heart rates and what correlates with being in the sweet spot of zone 2 or being at the right spot in the last minute of a moderate intensity interval. Now, note that for this moderate intensity interval training, I haven't given you any heart rate targets. And that's because this is a self-modulating approach that isn't tied to a specific heart rate. That will take care of itself. And again, if you finish a 5-minute work interval or a 3-minute work interval, whatever you set you're doing, and if the last 30 seconds of that were not difficult at all, you need to push harder on the next round. Conversely, if you have to stop your last work interval or the last minute of your work interval shy of whatever time limit that is, in our example, 5 minutes, let's say you get to 4 minutes and 30 seconds and you're done and you have to go into active rest, then you need to back off a little bit. You came out too hard. And and that's probably the most common mistake is people start these moderate intensity intervals too hard, too hot. In the first 2 minutes, they push too hard and they cannot sustain the pace for 5 minutes. Or if it's a 3-minute interval, the first minute they came out too hard and they can't finish the third. So start lower and build up minute by minute until that final minute, specifically the last 30 seconds, are very difficult for you. And again, it just takes a few sessions to get this stuff sorted out so you know what your boundaries and what your capacities are. Now, let me just reiterate this point. During your active rest period, you keep doing whatever exercise you're doing. So when I hit the end of a 5-minute interval and I go into active rest on the elliptical, I stay on the elliptical, I slow down my pace, I reduce the intensity level by pressing that button a handful of times, and I let my heart rate and my respiratory rate come back down until I'm fully recovered from my work interval. And again, if you're less conditioned, make sure that you take the full 5 minutes for active rest. If you already have a conditioning base and you recover faster, you might be able to go again after 3 minutes of active rest. And one way to see that if you're ready to go for the next round is to check to see if you can do nasal only breathing. If you're in an active rest interval and you're at the point where you can nasal breathe only and you're comfortable doing that, you're ready to go for the next interval. It doesn't matter what the time is on the watch. So in this example, it's 3 rounds of 5 minutes of hard work where the last 30 seconds is really hard to finish. And that equates to a total workload of 15 minutes, right? 3 rounds of 15 minutes of hard work, or I'm sorry, 3 rounds of 5 minutes of hard work is 15 minutes. And that doesn't include your rest or your warm up and cool down. And if you're taking the full 5 minutes to do your rest, then the total time for this moderate intensity interval training is like maybe 30 minutes. And listen, I don't care who you are. Anybody should be able to find 30 minutes twice a week to do this. No excuses. 2024 is here. Now, what you can do then, if you start with your 3 rounds of 5-minute intervals with 3 to 5 minutes of rest, then you want to work to progress to actually doing 3-minute intervals. So we can flip things around. And so the goal is eventually to be able to do 5 rounds of 3 minutes of hard work, followed by 3 to 5 minutes of active rest. And since the goal is to use a pace or intensity that makes the last 30 seconds of the work interval really hard, you push harder on a 3-minute work interval than you do for a 5-minute work interval, because you can only sustain that effort for 3 minutes and you can't sustain it for 5 minutes. So a 3-minute work interval is more demanding than a 5. And that's why we start with 3 rounds of 5-minute intervals with a 5-minute rest and progress over time. And ultimately, we're training essentially the same energy systems, the same muscle fiber types. And with the moderate intensity work, we're actually getting a blend of some zone 2 and some very high intensity work. It's like I said, it's kind of the love child. And it's not technically correct, but you guys get the idea. So just like the 5-minute intervals, the first minute or so of a 3-minute work interval is used to get your heart rate up to a point where you're pretty much forced to shift into active rest at the end of 3 minutes. If you can go longer than 3 minutes, go harder on the next round. If you can't get to the 3-minute mark, slow it down. Like I said, it's self-regulating. So we've talked about 3 minutes. We've talked about 5 minutes. What about 4 minutes? Does that work? Sure it does. It's just as valid and effective. And 4-minute intervals is actually the basis of what's called the Norwegian 4x4 protocol. And I'll put a link for this in the episode description so you can go check this out. But researchers at Norway's University of Science and Technology created this program to, in their mind, yield the best results in the shortest possible time. And one of the main outcomes or outcome measures of the research is VO2 max. And so 4x4 protocol, what does that mean? Well, it's pretty simple, right? 4 rounds of 4-minute work intervals, followed by 3 minutes of active rest. And again, just like the other descriptions, the first 2 minutes of each 4-minute work interval are used to get your heart rate up. And that 4th minute, particularly the last 30 seconds of the 4th minute, you should be counting down the seconds to the point where, okay, now I'm allowed to go into my active rest. This is self-modulating, just like the 3 and 5-minute intervals are. So you do 4 minutes of moderate intensity exercise that you can sustain for only 4 minutes. You do active rest for 3 minutes, and you repeat this 4 times. Simple, very effective. Now, having said that, the very first time you do this, maybe you can't do 4 rounds. That's okay. Maybe all you can do is 1 round of 4 minutes or 5 minutes or 3 minutes with rest. Maybe that's your starting point. Just because something's written down as a protocol doesn't mean that you should push to complete the protocol on your first session. In fact, I would suggest that you don't try to do that. If you decide, hey, I'm going to jump into moderate interval training, moderate intensity interval training with a 4x4 protocol, just take it easy in the sense of like if you get to finish your second round of the 4x4 and you're like, I'm done, do not keep pushing. Pushing you can save for later when you build some capacity. Be safe and be smart. Listen to your body. Now, if you do that, and let's say that you start a 4x4 protocol and you're doing this twice a week, and in the beginning you can only complete 2 of the 4 rounds. So you push for 4, rest for 3, push for 4, and then you're done. After a few weeks, you should be able to do a 3rd round. And if you can't, you're not progressing. And what I love about this entire approach is that it is self-regulating. You find your limits, you push your limits, you adapt. And if you're not adapting, you're doing something wrong. Something's not right, whether it's in the frequency, the intensity, the duration. And you can even zoom out and going, okay, how am I fueling my body? What's my diet like? Am I sleeping well? Am I controlling stress? Am I controlling my inflammatory state? And that's, the much bigger picture of everything that we've talked about in the last 2 years on the Inflammation Nation podcast. So if we put all of this together, kind of like a general summary of moderate intensity interval training, it is quite feasible for someone to start with 3 rounds of 5-minute work intervals, followed by 3 to 5 minutes of active rest. And when that becomes either boring or pretty easy, then you can progress to the 4x4 protocol, where you do 4 rounds of 4 minutes of higher intensity work, followed by 3 minutes of rest. And then progress to 5 rounds of 3 minutes of work intervals with 3 to 5 minutes of rest, depending on what your recovery capacity is. And that's arranged that way, starting with 5-minute work intervals, going to 4-minute work intervals, going to 3-minute work intervals, because that is an increasing level of exercise demand. So you start on the lower end, and then you progress as you can. And now let's try to put all of this together as we bring the episode in this mini-series and the year of 2023 to a close. I've made a big deal in this mini-series about not locking yourself into one cardio training approach versus another. And as I said, it's not about zone 2 versus interval training. It's about using both as tools to leverage the metabolic adaptations that each gives you. And having said that, nobody, including me, expects any of you listening to do 5 sessions of zone 2 lasting 45 minutes each, plus 2 sessions of very high intensity work every week, sprinkling in some moderate intensity to boot. Nobody expects that. And we haven't even talked yet about the value and importance of resistance training, which is going to be its own mini-series. And this is a problem that we see with a lot of the stuff that's out there on the internet and social media these days, is that it's this ever-growing list of things that you feel compelled that you have to do each and every day, each and every week, to the point where the list is so big and the time demand of being healthy is so long that you're thinking, my Lord, how can I ever fit all this in? I guess I'm going to be tired and overweight and foggy brained for the rest of my life because I just can't do it all. And I get it, because there's so many people out there saying so many different things and saying, if you're not doing this, then you're not doing it right. If you're not doing this and doing it this way, then you're not doing it right. And how do you make sense of it all? And that's why it's critical at times to back up and go big picture and ask yourself how all the pieces fit together and what is the synergy of blending different strategies. And so, yes, maybe if all you did was zone 2 training, you might have to do 3, 4, or 5 45-minute sessions per week to maximize your results. But you don't have to do that, one, when you're not a competitive athlete and you're not an endurance athlete particularly. And if your goals are simply wellness and metabolic control, promotion of longevity and quality of life, you don't have to do that. And you also don't have to do that when you synergize zone 2 training with some form of interval training, whether that's moderate intensity or high or very high intensity or some blend and combination of those things. And again, to that end, I suggest that most people start with training zone 2 only for a few weeks at least before adding in 1 to 2 sessions of the 5-minute moderate intensity training. But as you add time and sessions of moderate to higher intensity, you can get away with less zone 2 training. Just don't stop your zone 2 training, because it does things that the others can't. It's feasible at some point for you to be doing 1 to 2 sessions of each type of training per week in some mixture. Even if you did 1 zone 2, 1 moderate intensity interval training session, and 1 higher or very high intensity interval training session per week, you're going to be hitting all of the adaptations. So be smart, start low, go slow, and ask yourself what your goals are. What are you trying to accomplish? So having said all of that, this is my gift to you for the end of the year. I created a very quick and dirty Zone 2 and interval training quick reference guide that you can download on my website. I'll put the link in the episode description. It's a very simple single graphic. There's no text. There's no explanation. It's just a table that lays out some of the key points that I've made in our discussion today. And hopefully it helps you to organize your thinking. And as you look at it, maybe you'll remember some of the things. And, maybe it's a good idea to go back and re-listen to this podcast episode with that printed out in front of you, or maybe you download it to your phone. Now, my assumption here is that if you download and use this guide, you're making sure that you don't have any medical issues that would exclude you from doing this type of exercise, right? So be safe and be smart. The table is broken down into the simple guidelines for Zone 2, as well as the 3 different levels of moderate intensity interval training using 5-minute, 4-minute, and 3-minute intervals, as well as a description of the basics of Zone 5 intervals or very high intensity interval training, kind of like the Tabata style. And these are guidelines. You have to modify them to your capacity and to your own limitations. All right, guys, as we head into 2024, I hope that this mini-series on longevity and quality of life, and indeed this entire podcast, has added some value to your life. And I hope that I've helped you on your quest for better health. Why don't we tackle 2024 head on? Let's do it with intent. Let's do it with purpose. Let's do it with gusto. You can do it. I know you can. I wish you and your family the happiest of New Year's. And I'll see you on the next episode right here on the Inflammation Nation podcast.
Thanks for listening to Inflammation Nation. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you subscribe to our podcast. Be the first to know when a new episode drops so you can stay on top of your game. It also helps others like you find the answers they need. You can use the links in the episode description to check out Dr. Noseworthy's self-learning programs for thyroid, detox, and gut health. Or you can submit a question for the podcast and even reach out to Dr. Noseworthy directly.